Somewhere right now, some kid is reading a book with a one-eyed giant on the cover. A Cyclops, pure fiction. A monster somebody made up centuries ago, and we've all just quietly agreed to find it scary. That is basically what I grew up believing too. Monsters live in stories, bones live in science museums. Two completely separate worlds, no overlap, except that is wrong. Almost backwards, actually. And once you see how, you can't really unsee it. Here is the bit that genuinely got me when I started pulling this thread. In 12 different places, on 12 timelines that never once crossed paths, ancient people dug something up out of the ground. A skull, a leg bone the size of a tree trunk, teeth that didn't match anything they'd ever seen walking around alive, and instead of just shrugging and moving on, they built a monster around it. A whole story sized to fit the bone. Nobody tells you that order the bone came first. The monster came after, every single time. 12 cases. Let's go dig them up. Sit with this one for a second, because it really does flip the whole thing on its head. We assume people sat around fires inventing scary stories out of thin air, and somewhere down the line those stories hardened into myth, just imagination, running loose with nothing underneath it. It is almost never that simple. Over and over, in cultures with zero contact with each other, the exact same pattern shows up. Someone finds something terrifying half buried in the dirt. Then the story arrives, built specifically to make sense of what they're staring at. A skull with one massive hole punched dead center, a thigh bone 3 times the length of a grown man's leg, teeth as long as your hand, claws that belong to nothing anyone living has ever encountered. Nobody back then had the concept of extinction. The idea that an entire species could just be gone, wiped off the earth, forever no exceptions, wasn't a thought available to them. So when they hit a bone that size, the only thing that actually made sense was a monster that size. 12 stops on this trip, 12 different eras scattered across the whole map. Every single one starts off as a legend. Every single one ends up in a museum drawer somewhere, labeled and cataloged. Let's go. Stop 1. Sicily, roughly 3,000 years back. A shepherd's walking a stretch of coastline. The ground gives way under what turns out to be the mouth of a cave. And there it is, a skull, huge, bone white. Dead center, exactly where you'd expect an eye to sit, there is one enormous hole. The story takes off almost immediately. An entire race of one-eyed giants, supposedly living right here on this island. Centuries later, Homer writes it straight into the Odyssey. Polyphemus, the Cyclops, trapped in his cave with Odysseus's crew, getting his one eye put out with a sharpened stake. Here is what that skull actually belonged to, though. Sicily and the islands around it used to be home to dwarf elephants, a genuinely real species, just small, the result of living on islands with limited food and nowhere to grow. Their skulls have this one huge cavity sitting dead center, not for an eye, for the trunk. And here is the thing people skip over. Nobody in that era had ever seen an elephant, alive or dead. No reference point at all for what a trunk socket is even supposed to look like. So the hollow that used to hold a trunk became, in their minds, a single enormous eye socket. The Cyclops wasn't somebody's imagination running off the rails. It was a guy standing over an elephant's skull, trying his best to explain what he was looking at with absolutely zero information to go on. Honestly, kind of a reasonable guess, given what he had to work with. Stop 2. The Gobi Desert around 2,700 years ago. Nomadic gold prospectors keep hitting the same strange skeleton over and over while digging through red sandstone. 4 legs, a sharp curved beak, shoulder blades shaped almost exactly like folded wings. They describe all this to Greek traders passing through the region, a creature that lives in the mountains and guards the gold supply. Lion's body, eagle's head and wings. That is the Griffin, more or less assembled on the spot from a description. What they were actually pulling out of that sand was a Protoceratops. A beaked dinosaur roughly the size of a large dog, not even a particularly dramatic specimen by dinosaur standards. But after thousands of years of wind erosion, the frill bones at the back of its skull end up looking eerily like a set of folded wings. Add the beak, add the 4 legs. The Griffin was never invented from scratch. It was already sitting right there in the sand, fully assembled, just waiting for someone to misread it correctly. Stop 3. The island of Samos, about 2,500 years back. There is a local legend about a creature whose scream alone could crack open the ground. They called it the Neades. For a long, long time, nobody had any idea what this story was even pointing toward. It just sounded like classic exaggeration, the kind every culture has a version of. Then paleontologists started digging in those exact same hills. Turns out giant Miocene-era giraffes once roamed across Samos. Animals considerably bigger than the ones wandering around today. Their fossilized bones are scattered through the exact terrain the old stories come from. You find bones that size with zero concept of what a giraffe even is, let alone an extinct one running maybe triple the modern scale. What is the alternative explanation? You end up with a monster whose voice splits the earth. It almost writes itself once you've got the bones in front of you. Stop 4. The Australian wetlands. Old enough that nobody can really date it, carried down through Aboriginal oral tradition for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone was writing this stuff down. The Bunyip hides in the billabongs, drags you under if you wander too close to the water's edge. Every region tells a slightly different version, but the core warning never changes. Stay back from the water. Australia used to be home to Diprotodon, a wombat relative roughly the size of a small car. Strange to picture, but real. These animals gathered near water in herds, the way big grazing animals tend to, which means a lot of very large bones ended up scattered right at the water's edge over time. A fossil that size found in exactly the spot every single version of the legend tells you to avoid. At some point, the connection just makes itself. You don't even have to push for it. This next one's genuinely strange, and I'd guess almost nobody watching has heard it before. Stop 5. The island of Flores in Indonesia. Local legend talks about the Gogo, small, hairy, human-shaped creatures said to live deep in the forest. For generations, this got filed away as folk superstition, nothing more, the kind of story you tell kids to keep them out of the woods after dark. Then in 2003, archaeologists digging through a cave on Flores found something that genuinely changed the conversation. Skeletons of tiny, ancient hominins, barely over 3 feet tall, fully grown. Scientists ended up naming them Homo Floresiensis. The press, predictably, just started calling them hobbits, and the name stuck. Here's the part that really gets me, though. These weren't some distant species from millions of years back. They were living on this exact island as recently as 50,000 years ago, which sounds like forever until you put it next to everything else on this list. The Gogo might not be a myth at all. It might be a memory. One that just got passed down for so long it started sounding like folklore. Stop 6. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, Brazilian and Bolivian oral tradition, hunters out there describe the Mapinguari, a giant, one-eyed creature with a mouth set into its stomach. It moves slowly. It reeks of decay, and according to every version of the story, it is nearly impossible to actually kill. That description sounds completely invented, right up until you meet the real animal sitting underneath it. Giant ground sloths used to roam South America, and some of them stood over 10 feet tall when fully upright. Slow-moving, thick-skinned, built like genuinely nothing else alive on this planet today. Run into something that size moving through dense jungle, in low light, half glimpse through the trees. You'd remember that for the rest of your life. You'd probably build a story around it too. The fear didn't invent the Mapinguari. The sloth had already done most of the work. Stop 7. The wider Greco-Roman world around 2,000 years ago. The Roman Emperor Augustus actually kept a private collection at his villa in Capri. And I mean massive bones, labeled outright in his own records as the bones of giants. Weapons supposedly belonging to ancient heroes sat displayed right alongside them, like a trophy case. The historian Pliny wrote about a thigh bone, 10 feet long, belonging to a giant named Orestes. He wrote about it as established fact, not speculation. Those bones were Mammoth and Mastodon femurs. Here is the part nobody really thinks about. To someone with zero training in comparative anatomy, a mammoth's thigh bone looks remarkably close to a human's, just scaled up roughly 3 times over. An entire mythology of titans and giant heroes got built, brick by brick, on bones that were, in the most literal sense possible, just very large elephants. The giants were never people at any point in the story. They were elephants the whole way through. One stop on this list is still left, and it might be the most recent case of all of them. Stop 8. New Zealand, Maori oral tradition. There is a story about Te Hokioi, a bird massive enough to kill a fully grown man. For a long stretch of time, this got written off as pure legend, exaggeration passed down for entertainment. Then the fossil record actually backed it up. Haast's eagle was real. The largest eagle that has ever existed on this planet, with talons built specifically for taking down prey the size of a small deer. It went extinct around 1445, only about 200 years after the Maori first settled the islands. So this isn't some ancient myth dredged up from the dawn of human memory. This is a living recollection of a real predator that happened to get passed down as folklore, in real time, within a few generations of the bird actually disappearing. Stop 9. Japan, a tradition stretching back centuries. Tengu are part human, part bird spirits, known specifically for long, razor-sharp claws. Shrines all across Japan still preserve relics called Tengu no Sum. Literally, Tengu's claws treated as sacred objects, said to ward off evil. Said to cure possession in extreme cases. Those claws are fossilized shark teeth, triangular, serrated, and after enough time spent underwater and then buried, worn down into something that genuinely looks like a curved claw if you don't know what you are looking at. So a relic that has been sitting in temples for centuries, treated as something close to holy, turns out to be a shark's tooth that washed up off the ocean floor. Stop 10. The North Atlantic. Norse sailors' centuries of voyages out into open, freezing water. Sailors talked about the Kraken, a creature so enormous its body could be mistaken for an island, said to drag entire ships down beneath the waves, crew and all. Carolus Linnaeus, the actual father of modern taxonomy, the guy who basically invented how we classify living things, gave the Kraken a real scientific name in 1735. That is how seriously this was taken, even by people who should have known better. The Kraken is the giant squid, a genuinely real animal living deep in the ocean, growing past 40 feet in length. For centuries, basically nobody alive had ever seen one in person. Sailors only ever encountered the wreckage these animals occasionally left behind, or the scars on the bodies of sperm whales that had fought them. An animal that large, that elusive, that hard to actually witness firsthand. It was never going to stay a myth forever. It was just waiting on somebody to finally get a camera close enough. Stop 11. Medieval Europe and the Eurasian steppe. The unicorn, single horn, said to be impossible to capture, said to purify any water it touched with a dip of that horn. Medieval traders sold unicorn horns for genuinely staggering sums of money. These things were treated as priceless. The horns were real. The unicorn part was not. Those spiraled horns were narwhal tusks, smuggled south from Arctic waters by traders who had every financial incentive to keep the real source quiet. There is also a solid case that part of the legend traces back to Elasmotherium, an extinct giant rhino carrying one massive horn, which roamed across Eurasia until surprisingly recently in geological terms, much more recently than most people would guess. So you've got two completely real animals, neither one of them anything close to a unicorn, getting fused together over centuries into one legendary creature. Last stop, Klagenfurt, Austria. The year 1335. Workers digging through a gravel pit hit an enormous skull. Long, heavy, exactly the kind of thing that looks monstrous if you've genuinely never seen anything remotely like it before. The city decides more or less on the spot that this is proof of the dragon from their founding legend. They commission a statue of it for the town square. That statue is still standing there today. You can go look at it. The skull belonged to a woolly rhinoceros, a species that had already been extinct for thousands of years by the time anyone in 1335 dug it up. A city's entire founding myth, literally carved into stone and standing in the middle of the square, built on a misidentified rhino skull, somebody pulled out of a gravel pit by accident. The dragon never actually needed to exist for any of this to happen. The skull just needed to look enough, like 12 stops. 12 continents and centuries apart, no contact between any of these cultures whatsoever, and one pattern that never once breaks, not a single time across the entire list. Every culture on this list did the exact same thing completely independently of each other. They found something too big, too strange, too far outside anything they had language for. And instead of just saying, I don't know, which, to be fair, is a genuinely hard thing for anyone to admit, in any era, they built a story large enough to hold what they'd found. I don't actually think that is a flaw in how ancient people thought. I think it is just how every human brain handles a gap it can't explain on its own. You fill it with the best story available to you at the time. For thousands of years on every continent, the best available story kept turning out to be monster. The bones were always real. Every single time. The monster was just the first reasonable guess anyone made at explaining them. Go back to the question I opened with, right at the start of all this. You probably assumed monster myths came first, and that bones were never really part of the picture at all. 12 cases later, it is the exact opposite every single time, without a single exception on this list. The bone came first. The story got built around it afterward. Every single time. Next time you see a Cyclops show up on screen or a dragon stitched into somebody's coat of arms, take a closer look. Somewhere, centuries back, there was a real person standing over a real skull they had absolutely no way of explaining. What you are actually looking at, more often than you'd think, is a fossil wearing a costume. I don't think you are going to see these the same way again. I know I don't. Case file closed. 12 cases, 12 fossils, all of them solved. Next time, we're doing the complete opposite of this. One single case file, and we go all the way down to the bottom of it. One object, one question that, as far as I can tell, nobody has ever actually shown you the answer to. That investigation's coming soon. Out of all 12 of these, which one actually got you? Tell me down in the comments. I genuinely read every single one of them.